Welcome, everybody. We are here for another episode of the Free Speech Forward podcast, one I've been looking forward to because today we get to interview a great interviewer. If this is your first time here, I'm one of your co-hosts, Joia, also a co-founder of 1776 Forward, which is one of the sponsors of this podcast, along with the Institute for Liberal Values. And I'm here with my co-founder, co-host, Chris, who is going to introduce our guest, Mars.
Hey Mars, thank you for being on. How are you doing?
I'm doing okay. Thank you for having me.
Great. Well, as Joya mentioned, we've got Mars Cheung on with us today. And for those of you listening, just a little bit about his background before we dive in. Mars entered the discussions about current cultural crisis through his interest and involvement within the greater overall intellectual community, reaching back as far as 2014. Upon encountering inconsistency in the application of humanistic values and intellectual inquiry towards people of varying ethnic, religious, and sociological backgrounds by supposedly progressive organizations, he applied his efforts and skill sets as an engineer and a speaker towards whoever and whatever individuals and organizations which are in line with the values of intellectual honesty and enlightenment humanism towards the resolution of those inconsistencies. In addition to volunteer work with a number of humanitarian organizations, Mars regularly hosts online talks and interviews with knowledgeable speakers to inform and educate about matters related to said values. So I love that. This is exactly the type of person we like to have these conversations about enlightenment and humanist values. So let's dive right in. Why don't you tell us your background, Mars, and how you became a leader in free speech issues?
Well, I wouldn't call myself a leader in free speech issues, but it's definitely a value that I certainly champion. I think it's more accurate to say that I became a strong advocate for it almost 10 years ago because I was introduced to the depth of the concept largely because I became a fan of what people call the new atheists, the Four Horsemen: Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, and Daniel Dennett. The intellectualism of the Fourth Horseman and others really introduced me to the idea and had me exploring the values of what we call Western values, more accurately referred to, in my opinion, as values coming forth from the 17th century Enlightenment and so on. And free speech just happened to fall in that category, and I fell into exploring the nuances behind it as a result. That's how I became a champion of that value. But a leader, well, I'm still learning about it myself and working out all the rights and nuances that go along with that.
Well, I think even just having the platform that you do and speaking with, all the leaders and intellectuals on enlightenment values, I think speaks to that. So, I mean, certainly, I think you're being humble, but we certainly see you that way and appreciate your voice. So, understood.
And we appreciate the work that you're doing, bringing us these fabulous interviews with so many fascinating guests. So tell us more then why you think free speech matters, both for you personally and for society as a whole, so that we can flourish and thrive.
Okay, well, John Stuart Mill's book on liberty. I don't know if you guys have read that or not. I tried reading it myself, and whenever someone brings me a book that is written in the English of that area, it's really really hard to read the prose and whatnot. So I read someone who was able to break that all down and put it in modern English. But yeah, going back to that, John Stuart Mill's on liberty does this subject justice in a way I can't, but I'll do my best to break it down here. Free speech is necessary for communicating ideas and for thinking. Tribalism is a dirty word in today's parlance because it really heavily implies that we're solid away in our own echo chambers. But the fact of the matter is that it's a necessary part of human existence. We share values and ideas that form the basis of our local communities. But being beings that are subject to our own biological impulses, we're subject to groupthink. And we can be carried along the sway of social and public opinion. And we see that nowadays with left and right groups that just swing in their own respective directions. We're siloed away into our own news networks. And everyone's basic epistemological process is just to rely on a media source that caters to your own tribe. Free speech means sharing ideas, views, and perspectives, and sometimes what someone shares with you will we'll just, I'm sorry to say it, it's just going to grate on your sensitivities. You're going to be offended, you're going to be tweaked, and you're going to learn. Bottom line. So why is free speech such an important topic? Well, you need to hear other perspectives, and sometimes I think John Stuart Mill said something along the lines of, if I don't remember the exact phrase, I might be butchering it here, but if there's one person in the crowd that's speaking the truth, the entire crowd is saying one thing, then you are not justified in silencing this one person. I mean, he might have a truth or even a small bit of the truth for you to consider, for you to approach truth in an idea in some way, shape, or form. And truth is the fundamental basis on which we base our values and our epistemology. And this is what makes for a free, classically liberal society. And the classical liberal societies are arguably the best all in the world. So it's a value for that's worth protecting for each and every single citizen. Unfortunately, not all of us understand everything that goes right into it. It's often a topic that is, well, it's often broken down into the idea that it's free speech. Free speech is okay for me, but not for you. If I say things that is good from my side of the aisle that I may consider moral, and someone else says something completely different, then that side is evil, and therefore that speech can be silenced. No. Free speech is what allows us to approach nuances and truth in between.
Yeah, what perfectly said. I mean, it's easy to uphold freedoms when you're in the majority, right? Because essentially you're appealing to that majority view, which is a kind of logical fallacy in its own right. But it's these freedoms are really for the minority views, and I think you wonderfully connected it to that element of truth seeking, right? Like that. Truth doesn't come from how many people agree with something, as we've seen throughout scientific and intellectual history. It's whether it's objectively, correct or not correct, in describing reality in the world. So I love that. Thank you. Why don't we shift gears a little bit and then get a little bit more of your own thinking as a speaker on enlightenment and humanist values, and frankly, as someone who does a lot of interviews with other prominent intellectuals on the same. So what's kind of your process or method for preparing to either interview somebody, write an essay, give a speech on a topic of interest for you? What are some of the tools and tips that you use to convey and communicate your ideas in a powerful and flourishing manner?
Well, there's two angles to answer there. One is my preferred interview process, and the other is how do I give a speech. Well, going with the interview first, I had an interesting experience a few months ago. A nearby university, UCSD, hosted Mossab Hassan Youssef for a talk regarding the current crisis in the Middle East. And I'm someone who's read his book. I'm familiar with his story. I'm familiar with his work, and I was really hoping to go to the interview to get something out of something more that I wouldn't have been able to get just from reading someone's book alone. With all due respect to anyone who might be listening, that was the worst interview I've ever listened to. I had to apologize to my friend afterwards, because every time the interviewer opened her mouth, I literally went, because the questions were just so banal and just so lacking in substance that the questions that are going through my head: did you read this gentleman's book? Do you realize the significance of who you're talking to? Do you realize you're wasting an opportunity to bring knowledge, perspective, and angles of thought that people may not have always considered? Do you realize how important this guest is? And regarding the interviews I do, like with whatever guest I have on, one of the things I try to do is, number one, if they have a book out there, I read it from beginning to finish, or I try to get as much of it as I can into my system as possible. If they have articles, podcast interviews, whatever, I try to review those to get a sense for who this person is, what their talking points are, what is their bailiwick, what can they dive into, and what other angle, what other ideas can I try to bring out that people may not have always considered. Now, I do ask some banal questions myself because while I might be familiar with this guest, my audience may not be. But what I do
Mm,
try to do is try to dig um, appropriately to try to like tease out some ideas that were not previously addressed. So for my interview processes, I give myself a script. I give myself an idea of what I want to ask, and I can only do that if I'm as familiar with the material
mm,
as possible. So read, research, and organize. That's my process for preparing for an interview. As for giving a speech, I've actually spoken quite a bit in the past in front of an audience. The largest audience I've ever spoken in front of, it wasn't a full speech, but it was in front of an audience of over 300 people in Las Vegas. I used to compete regularly on the Toastmasters international the Toastmasters speech contest,
mm,
and
mm-hmm.
I've almost made it all the way to the international level before.
Wow.
That really taught me a lot about how to communicate effectively, because I still have a stutter in my voice and I can talk very quickly. I trip over my words, and if I don't prepare myself ahead of time for a dialogue with somebody, if I haven't read, I haven't written, my words come out garbled. You won't be able to understand a single thing I'm saying. How do I prepare for giving a speech? Well, the first thing I do is I limit the scope of my message. If you can't describe exactly what you want to say in 2 sentences or less, you have no message. And so know exactly what you want to say, be able to define that and build on that. Step two, write your speech out. Well, have a few stories that tie into one another to illustrate the ideas you want to communicate, and have them lead right into and build on top of another, so they lead into a climax of an idea that you want rolling around in the mind of your audience, when you administer your conclusion. Next, learn how to use your body language to communicate. Look people in the eyes. Use proper vocal inflections, use your hands, your body to speak, and demonstrate confidence in your words. We don't communicate simply by our words alone. Like, our tones, our postures, they communicate more than just words do themselves. And, if something I've told my mentees is that if you show that you have no confidence in what you're saying, if your voice is low, your body posture is hunched over, you're not looking your audience in the eyes, you're showing that you don't believe in what you have to say. And if you don't believe in what you have to say, if you have no confidence in your words, why should anyone listen to you?
Mm,
So limit the scope of what you want to say, keep it to that, write your speech out, get an idea of what you want to say into your mind,
mm,
and learn how to use your voice, learn how to use your body, learn how to project confidence, learn how to connect with your audience on a personal level. And that's how you want to sell a message anytime you're giving a speech.
Thank you. That was so powerful, and I think it will even help Chris and myself and members of the audience craft more powerful speeches ourselves. So I'd like to ask a question that is one of our favorite questions to ask guests, just to hear your ideas for where society ought to go with the value of free speech. And the question is, if you had all the money, all the time, all the resources anyone could ever want, what do you think is the most important project we could be pursuing for the cause of free speech today?
Well, first of all, I've had all the money in the world. I spend my life just being a student. I'm pretty sure that's not the question, not the answer you want to hear. But
I would probably
no,
be doing
seriously.
the same
we,
thing though, so
yeah, well, and that's why we like this question, to bring out whatever the response is, because sometimes it elucidates some really interesting insights.
I'm kidding. Totally kidding. I'm totally joking there. But okay, so if I had the resources, the time, etc., what I would invest in is the I'm blanking on history now. I think like in old Roman in I think it was the time of Socrates or the Greek philosophers. There was an arena that people could come into and talk and debate. I would invest in. I'm a big fan of Peter Boghossian's street epistemology. Um, it's pretty much just the use of the Socratic method, in which when you approach an idea, whether it's banal or controversial, you.
There we go. No problem.
But going back to what I was saying before, we can think from syllogism to syllogism to get to conclusion, but if your ideas are not grounded, then your ideas can easily just float off into space. And from that standpoint, you can justify anything. It might be intelligent, it might be logical, but if it's not grounded, it's not. It's not how we currently understand
Mm-hmm.
reality. So if I had all the money in the world, if I had the time, I would build facilities to teach basic street epistemology, and I would teach a system of critical thinking based on the definition that I asserted right there, because I think that limits the scope of what it is. Because that phrase gets thrown around so often by people from all over the political spectrum, all over different religions, different ideologies, or whatever. But almost every time I hear a definition, I almost never hear a concrete one. At least not based in the systems of epistemology from the three in the modernist era, which I believe is the strongest the definition there is for critical thinking.
Yeah, no, I love that. I mean, that's why even in my own conception of it, you know, it's both. It's not just the logic piece, but also the reality piece, right? And I often think of this issue as being reality based versus rationalism, you know, kind of as a
Exactly.
shorthand,
Yeah.
because I think the latter refers to what you kind of aptly called mental masturbation, or you know, free floating abstractions not concretely grounded to empirical evidence, whereas being reality based is the opposite. So and you're invoking a critical thinking just really hits home well for us, because certainly as Joy and I have thought about this issue, kind of both critical thinking and communication skills, I think, are equally
Yes.
critical here. And so, and you're the first person to highlight the two of them and this great idea of street epistemology centers. So this is why we love this question so much. So thank you. And that does take us almost to the end of our time. So as a quick parting question, we like to end with any kind of more oriented towards our audience and helping them become leaders in free speech, or even just leaders in expressing their own voice and views. Any tips you would share of how people can find their voice to stand up and speak out for their values?
So I think I'm a little unusual in this regard because I make my full time job as an engineer, um, and I often tell people that if I could go back and do college again, in addition to getting my degree in computer science, I probably would get a minor in philosophy as well. I spend a lot of my time reading. I spend a lot of my time listening to podcasts, and sometimes pulling out my iPad. And one of the best purchases I
Mm.
ever made, my Apple Pencil. Um, I read a little bit. I write and try to summarize what it is I just wrote or read, and try to get it into my own words so I can have the ghost of an idea of what to talk about if I ever have to bring the subject up. I try to be as familiar with a particular area of knowledge as possible, and I'm planning to get back into this because I'm planning to do a lot more public speaking. I try to write my ideas out on speech and how to reinforce them, but keeping them in a narrow keeping them on in a narrow scope of focus, so I can focus on one area and be able to extrapolate on this one area. And I can expand on that later, but like, you need to narrow your message. You need to narrow what it is you're talking about. Otherwise, you'll go everywhere, and your audience isn't going to get anything out of it. Read, write, organize what it is you want to say in your head. Learn how to speak in front of a group of people. Learn how to communicate your ideas with your body, with your voice, with your eyes. Learn how to convey emotions subtly in in the topics of whatever it is you want to speak about, to show why is it important to you, why is it important to you as a speaker, and why it should be important to your audience. You can grab them by the heart. You can have the benefit of reaching out through them through the ethos, but also through logic because of the content of your speech. Um, if you can communicate logically, if you can communicate on a humanistic level, then I think you can reach your audience in several special, significant ways. Um, and the final stickler in all this is like how do you want to use all of that I just described to communicate a very difficult idea, a very controversial one. That's something that I can't advise everyone on, because everyone has to find their own courage in those on those topics on their own time. But one of the things I think we should all think about is, if you don't speak about these items, who will? And who
Mm,
will is not always someone you want to be speaking on these issues, because often, as we see, some people who speak about controversy are not the people who do so on a responsible basis. You always want to be the one threading the needle. You don't want to fall into extremes. You want to communicate ideas with what I hope is the sincere desire to make for a better world for everyone around us. So, if anything gives you courage to speak on controversy, know this: if you don't, who will? And I think that's something we should all think
mm,
about.
mm-hmm. Wonderfully said. Courage, I think, is one of the key qualities for anybody to find their voice. And as they say, it is contagious. So usually, you just need one person to stand up and speak out, and very quickly, what feels like you started out alone, you come to realize, in fact, you're not. There's many other people right there beside you, backing you, or then find their voice. So, I really appreciate you saying that. And it's certainly something we advocate at 1776 Forward. So, um, thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
your time, Mars. This was great. And for all of our listeners out there, as always, you can look for us every other week on Tuesdays. We drop a new episode, and you can always find us on our website, 1776forward.com, or at the ILV's website, ilvalues.org, and on their Apple and Spotify podcast channels for the Dissidents podcast. So until next time, we'll see you, and thanks for
Thank you.
being on with us, Mars.